The flames crested the hill like a vengeful army, devouring everything in their path, as Elizabeth Robbins stared in horror at the approaching inferno. She had never imagined that her afternoon sketching trip to capture the beauty of Arizona Territory's wildflowers would end with her facing death beneath a merciless September sun in 1881. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her skirts and ran, her easel and art supplies abandoned behind her. The smoke billowed around her, thick and choking, stinging her eyes and burning her lungs. Each breath became more painful than the last as she stumbled down the hillside, disoriented by the wall of heat pursuing her. "God help me," she gasped, fumbling with her handkerchief to cover her mouth as ash rained down around her. The delicate cotton offered little protection against the acrid smoke. Her long auburn hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, whipping wildly around her face as she searched desperately for any path to safety. The dry summer had left the land parched, creating perfect conditions for the wildfire that now consumed everything in its wake. Elizabeth had only arrived in Yuma, Arizona, 3 weeks prior, leaving behind her life in Boston to accept a position as a schoolteacher. The small frontier town nestled along the Colorado River had seemed like an adventure, a chance to escape the stifling expectations of Eastern society after her fiancé had broken their engagement for a wealthier match. Now, as the fire closed in, that decision seemed foolish beyond measure. She had ventured too far from town, ignoring warnings about how quickly conditions could change in this unforgiving landscape. The flames moved faster than she could run, and the rising wind only hastened their advance. Her lungs burned with each labored breath, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. "Help!" she cried out, though she knew the wilderness would swallow her voice. The nearest farm was miles away, and the town even farther. No one would hear her. No one would come. Elizabeth stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully as she lost her footing on the uneven ground. She fell hard, the impact driving what little air remained from her lungs. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, forcing her back to the ground with a cry of despair. The smoke thickened around her, obscuring her vision until she could barely see 10 feet ahead. This was how she would die, she realized with sudden, terrible clarity. Alone in a strange land, forgotten by all who once knew her, the thundering of hooves cut through her panic, so distant at first that she thought she'd imagined it. Then louder, closer, until a massive chestnut stallion burst through the curtain of smoke. The rider pulled hard on the reins, bringing the animal to a skidding halt beside her. "Madam," the man's voice was deep, urgent. "We need to go, now." Elizabeth looked up through tear-filled eyes at the broad-shouldered figure silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky. His face was partially covered by a bandana, but she could see intense blue eyes beneath the brim of his Stetson. Without waiting for her response, he dismounted in one fluid motion and was at her side in an instant. "My ankle," she managed between coughs. "I can't, no time," he cut her off, his gaze darting to the approaching wall of flame. In one swift movement, he shrugged off his long leather duster and wrapped it around her shoulders. The coat engulfed her, still warm from his body and smelling of leather, horse, and something distinctly masculine. Before she could protest, his strong arms lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. She found herself seated sideways on the saddle, the stranger mounting behind her in one smooth motion. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, pressing her against his solid chest. "Hold tight," he ordered, and then they were moving, the powerful horse responding instantly to its master's commands. The stallion surged forward, muscles bunching beneath them as it galloped away from the approaching fire. Elizabeth clung to the saddle horn, acutely aware of the stranger's body pressed against her back, his arms forming a protective cage around her. The leather coat shielded her from the worst of the heat and flying embers, though the smoke remained inescapable. They rode hard, the horses' hooves pounding against the earth as they raced the fire toward the river. Elizabeth's heart thundered in time with each stride. She had never been held so intimately by a man, not even her former fiancé. Yet in this moment of terror and relief, propriety seemed a distant concern. The cowboy guided his horse with the confidence of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, navigating treacherous terrain, even as visibility worsened. Elizabeth could feel his steady breathing against her back, a stark contrast to her own panicked gasps. "Almost there," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Just hold on a little longer." The smoke began to thin as they approached the river, replaced by the sweet promise of cooler air. When they finally broke free from the worst of it, Elizabeth drew a desperate breath. The Colorado River stretched before them, a shimmering ribbon of blue against the scorched landscape. The cowboy didn't slow until they reached the water's edge. Only then did he rein in his lathered horse, sliding from the saddle before helping Elizabeth down. Her legs buckled beneath her when her injured ankle touched the ground, and once again his strong arms caught her. "Easy now," he said, lowering her gently to sit on a flat rock near the water's edge. With the immediate danger past, Elizabeth finally got a proper look at her rescuer as he pulled down his bandana. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble, and those startlingly blue eyes she'd glimpsed earlier. His face was tanned and weathered from long days under the Arizona sun, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes, suggesting he smiled more often than not. "Ethan Prescott," he introduced himself with a slight nod that might have been accompanied by a tip of his hat, had he not been busy examining the state of his horse. "Ranch foreman at the Lazy J, about 5 miles east of here." "Elizabeth Robbins," she replied, her voice raspy from smoke. "The new schoolteacher in Yuma. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Prescott. You saved my life." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Call me Ethan, and no thanks needed. Nobody should be left to face that kind of death." He gestured toward the fire, which was still visible as an ominous orange glow in the distance, though the river provided a natural barrier between them and the flames. Ethan unscrewed a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. Elizabeth accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply of the lukewarm water. "What were you doing out here alone, Miss Robbins?" he asked, his tone suggesting he found her presence puzzling rather than improper. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. "I was painting wildflowers. I've been documenting the local flora since I arrived. I didn't realize how far I'd wandered from town, or that the fire would move so quickly." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "This land doesn't forgive mistakes easily. Fires like that can outrun a horse if the wind's right." He crouched beside her, his eyes dropping to her ankle. "May I?" At her nod, his calloused hands gently examined her injury, his touch unexpectedly delicate for a man of his size and strength. Elizabeth winced as his fingers probed the tender area. "Not broken," he concluded, "but a bad sprain. You won't be walking back to town today." "I hadn't considered how I might get back," Elizabeth admitted, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that she had lost all her art supplies and nearly her life. The magnitude of what had happened crashed over her, and to her mortification, tears welled in her eyes. Ethan stood quickly, clearly uncomfortable with her emotional display. He busied himself with checking his horse, giving her a moment to compose herself. Elizabeth wiped away her tears with the back of her hand, clutching his leather coat more tightly around her shoulders. "Storm's tired, but he can carry us both to the ranch," Ethan finally said, referring to his chestnut stallion. "It's closer than town. We'll get you patched up proper, then I can take you to Yuma in the morning." Elizabeth considered his offer. Spending the night at a strange man's ranch would be scandalous by Boston standards. But this wasn't Boston, and refusing would be both ungrateful and impractical. Besides, he had just saved her life. If he had dishonorable intentions, he'd had ample opportunity to act on them already. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Prescott." "Ethan," she corrected herself. "I accept with gratitude." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he helped her to her feet, or rather, foot, as she kept her weight off the injured ankle. With efficient movements, he lifted her onto Storm's back before mounting behind her. This time, she didn't stiffen at the proximity. Instead, Elizabeth found herself relaxing against his chest as exhaustion began to claim her. They rode in silence for a time, following the river before turning inland toward the ranch. The last rays of sunlight painted the landscape in gold and crimson, a beautiful sight that contrasted sharply with the destructive fire still visible in the distance. "Have you been in Arizona Territory long?" Elizabeth asked, partly to distract herself from the pain in her ankle and partly from genuine curiosity about this taciturn man who had appeared from nowhere to save her. 10 years, he replied after a moment. "Came west after the war. Needed open spaces after seeing too much death." Elizabeth nodded, though he couldn't see her face. "I've only been in Yuma 3 weeks. It's quite different from Boston." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her back. "I reckon that's putting it mildly, Miss Robbins." "Please call me Elizabeth," she said. "It seems only fair since you've asked me to use your given name." "Elizabeth," he repeated, the word sounding different in his deep voice, almost like a caress. They lapsed into companionable silence again, as the Lazy J Ranch came into view, a sprawling property with a main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings. Several cowboys paused in their evening chores to watch as Ethan rode in with Elizabeth, curiosity evident on their weather-beaten faces. An older Mexican woman emerged from the main house, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Elizabeth wrapped in Ethan's coat and cradled against him. "Maria," Ethan called out as he reined Storm to a halt. "This lady needs help. Caught in the wildfire, hurt her ankle." Maria hurried forward, concern etched on her kind face. "Dios mío, bring her inside quickly." With gentle hands, Ethan lifted Elizabeth from the saddle, carrying her toward the house. Elizabeth found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right temple, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his blue eyes before he glanced away. The main house was modestly furnished but clean and comfortable. Maria directed Ethan to place Elizabeth on a sofa in the sitting room before bustling off to prepare a room and fetch supplies for her ankle. Ethan carefully set her down, ensuring her injured foot was elevated on a cushion. "Thank you," Elizabeth said softly, suddenly aware that she was still wearing his coat. She began to shrug it off. "Keep it for now," he said, stepping back. "I need to see to Storm and let the boys know about the fire. Maria will look after you. She's been keeping the Lazy J running smooth since before I got here." Before Elizabeth could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the lingering scent of leather and pine that clung to his coat. She leaned back against the cushions, closing her eyes briefly as the events of the day washed over her. Had it only been hours ago that she was peacefully painting wildflowers? Now she found herself in a strange house, saved by a mysterious cowboy with eyes the color of the Arizona sky. Maria returned with bandages, a basin of cool water, and what smelled like an herbal poultice. "That Ethan," she said with a fond shake of her head as she gently removed Elizabeth's boot and began tending to her swollen ankle. "Always finding strays to bring home. Though usually they have 4 legs, not 2. Elizabeth smiled despite herself. "He saved my life. The fire came so quickly, and when I fell—" Maria nodded, her expert fingers wrapping Elizabeth's ankle. "He is a good man. Quiet, yes, but with a big heart. The ranch owner, Mr. Jenkins, trusts him with everything." She secured the bandage and patted Elizabeth's hand. "There, not so bad, but you must rest it for several days." "I need to return to town tomorrow," Elizabeth protested. "My students' school can wait a few days," came Ethan's voice from the doorway. He had removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. Without the hat shadowing his features, he looked younger, though no less imposing. "Fire's headed away from Yuma, but it's cut off the main road. We'll have to wait for it to burn out or for the rain that's supposed to come in 2 days." Elizabeth's heart sank. "But my position, I can't just disappear." "Already taken care of," Ethan said. "Sent one of the boys to town with a message about what happened. Doc Peterson will let the school board know you're safe, but laid up for a few days." The thoughtfulness of this gesture left Elizabeth momentarily speechless. In Boston, she had grown accustomed to navigating life's challenges alone, especially after her parents' deaths 3 years prior had left her with only distant relatives who viewed her more as an obligation than family. Having someone simply handle a problem for her, and with such quiet efficiency, was both foreign and oddly comforting. "Thank you," she finally said. "You've been extraordinarily kind to a complete stranger." Something like embarrassment crossed his face. "Just doing what needed doing." He glanced at Maria. "Supper ready, just now," the older woman replied, rising from her knees beside Elizabeth. "I will bring a tray for the señorita here." "No need," Elizabeth said quickly, attempting to stand. "I can join you at the table. I don't wish to be more trouble." Ethan frowned, moving to her side as she wobbled unsteadily. "Stubborn, aren't you?" he muttered, but there was no heat in his words. He offered his arm. "Lean on me, then, but don't go putting weight on that ankle." Elizabeth accepted his support, acutely aware of the solid strength of his arm beneath her hand. They made their slow way to the dining room, where a simple but hearty meal awaited. Maria had set out a veritable feast of beans, corn bread, roast beef, and fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden. Ethan held Elizabeth's chair for her before taking his own seat across the table. For a man who spent his days commanding cowboys and cattle, he displayed surprisingly refined manners. Elizabeth wondered again about his background, but something in his demeanor suggested personal questions would not be welcome. The meal passed pleasantly enough, with Maria doing most of the talking, telling Elizabeth about the ranch and the surrounding area. Ethan ate quietly, occasionally contributing a comment or correction, but mostly watching Elizabeth with an intensity that made her both self-conscious and intrigued. As the meal concluded, Ethan excused himself to check on the ranch hands and ensure the property was secure for the night. Elizabeth found herself staring after him, curious about this man of few words who had ridden through fire to save a woman he didn't know. "He lost someone," Maria said softly, following Elizabeth's gaze. "In a fire during the war. His sister, I think. He doesn't talk about it, but Mr. Jenkins told me once, after Ethan rode out in a blizzard to save a family whose wagon had overturned." She began clearing the dishes. "He doesn't let people get close, but he will ride through hell itself to keep others from suffering." Elizabeth's heart constricted at this revelation. No wonder he had risked his life to save her from the flames. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I won't mention it to him." Maria nodded approvingly. Come, I will show you to your room. You need rest after such a day. The guest room was small but comfortable, with a patchwork quilt covering the bed and simple curtains framing the window. A pitcher and basin stood on a small table, along with a nightgown that Maria explained had belonged to Mrs. Jenkins before her passing 2 years prior. The ranch has been too quiet since she died, Maria said with a sigh. Mr. Jenkins stays mostly in town now, leaving Ethan to run things. Men need a woman's touch to soften their rough edges. She gave Elizabeth a meaningful look that made her blush. I'm only passing through, Elizabeth reminded her. Once my ankle heals, I'll return to my duties in Yuma. Maria merely smiled, a knowing glint in her dark eyes. Sleep well, señorita. Tomorrow is a new day. Left alone, Elizabeth changed awkwardly into the borrowed nightgown, careful of her bandaged ankle. She washed her face and hands in the basin, grimacing at the smell of smoke that clung to her hair. A proper bath would have to wait. As she settled beneath the quilt, exhaustion swept over her. Yet sleep proved elusive as her mind replayed the day's events, the terror of the fire, the miraculous appearance of Ethan Prescott, the feel of his strong arms around her as they rode to safety. Just beyond her window, she could hear the soft sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, and the low murmur of men's voices from the direction of the bunkhouse. So different from the city sounds she had known all her life. Eventually, her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted into dreams filled with fire and a pair of intense blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the curtains, and the aroma of coffee and bacon wafting up from the kitchen below. Elizabeth awoke disoriented before remembering the previous day's events. Her ankle throbbed dully as she cautiously swung her legs over the side of the bed. A soft knock at the door preceded Maria's entrance with a tray of breakfast and a simple blue dress draped over her arm. "Good morning, señorita," she greeted cheerfully. "I brought you something to wear. It was Mrs. Jenkins, but I think it will fit well enough with some pins." Elizabeth accepted the dress gratefully. "You're very kind, Maria. I fear my own dress is beyond saving after yesterday." "Smoke and ash, yes," Maria agreed, setting down the breakfast tray. "I have washed your underthings, though. They will be dry soon." She helped Elizabeth dress, adjusting the slightly too large bodice with expert fingers and a few well-placed pins. "How is the fire today?" Elizabeth asked as she sat to eat her breakfast. "Burning still, but the wind changed overnight. Ethan says the road to town might be passable tomorrow if the rain comes as expected." Maria busied herself tidying the room. "He is working with the cattle this morning, moving them further from where the fire might spread." Elizabeth nodded, surprised by the pang of disappointment she felt at the thought of returning to town so soon. She had been eager to begin her life in Yuma, embracing the adventure of the frontier, but something about the quiet strength of Ethan Prescott intrigued her in a way no man ever had. After breakfast, Maria helped Elizabeth downstairs and out to the porch, where a comfortable chair awaited with a footstool for her injured ankle. The view from the ranch house overlooked rolling grasslands dotted with cattle and bordered by distant mountains. In the clear morning light, Elizabeth could see a thin line of smoke on the horizon where the wildfire continued its slow burn. "I brought you these," Maria said, handing Elizabeth a small slate and several pieces of chalk. "Thought you might like to sketch, since you mentioned painting yesterday." Touched by the thoughtfulness, Elizabeth accepted the simple art supplies. "Thank you, Maria. That's exactly what I needed." Left alone on the porch, Elizabeth began to sketch the landscape before her. The slate was a poor substitute for her lost art supplies, but there was something soothing about the familiar act of capturing the world around her. She became so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice Ethan's approach until his shadow fell across her drawing. "You're talented," he said, his voice startling her. Elizabeth looked up to find him watching her work with genuine interest. He had removed his hat, and sweat dampened his dark hair, evidence of a morning's hard labor. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong, tanned forearms marked with old scars and the results of years of ranch work. "Thank you," she replied, feeling inexplicably shy under his direct gaze. "It's just a simple sketch." "Captures the feel of the place," he said, nodding toward the slate. "Most folks just see land, you see." "More." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "Art has always been my passion, though teaching is my profession." She hesitated, then added, "I lost all my supplies in the fire." They weren't valuable, but they were mine. Something like understanding flickered in Ethan's eyes. "Town has a general store, not much for art supplies, but better than a slate." "I'll visit when I return," she said with a small smile. "How are the cattle?" "Safe for now," he replied, leaning against the porch railing. "Fire's moving northeast. Should miss us entirely if the rain comes tonight like it's supposed to." They fell into an awkward silence, neither sure how to proceed with conversation now that practical matters had been addressed. Elizabeth found herself studying his profile as he gazed out over his domain, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, as though perpetually on guard against threats. "Maria mentioned you've been foreman here for some time," she ventured. "You must enjoy the work," he nodded. "Suits me. Open spaces, honest labor, clear purpose." He glanced at her. "Different from teaching, I expect." "Not as different as you might think," Elizabeth replied, setting aside her sketch. "Both require patience and faith that your efforts will bear fruit, even when the immediate results are uncertain." This earned her a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him, transforming his stern features and crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Never thought of it that way," he admitted. "Smart as well as talented." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "Tell me about the Lazy J," she said, eager to shift attention away from herself. "How many acres? How many cattle?" To her surprise, Ethan pulled up a chair and began to talk, his initial terseness giving way to animated descriptions of the ranch, its operations, and the challenges and rewards of cattle ranching in Arizona territory. As he spoke, Elizabeth saw glimpses of passion beneath his reserved exterior, a man who had found his place in the world and purpose in his work. "The land gets in your blood," he concluded, his gaze drifting back to the distant mountains. "Can't imagine living anywhere else now." "I understand that feeling," Elizabeth said softly. "I've only been in Arizona a short time, but there's something about the wildness of it, the raw beauty." She trailed off, remembering how that same wildness had nearly claimed her life the day before. "It'll kill you if you're not careful," Ethan said bluntly, as though reading her thoughts. "But I reckon that's true anywhere. At least here you can see the danger coming most times." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of ranch life. Elizabeth found herself reluctant to end this peaceful interlude, this unexpected connection with a man so different from those she had known in Boston. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of one of the ranch hands, a young cowboy who approached with an apologetic expression. "Boss, got trouble with that new bull in the north pasture, broke through the fence again." Ethan sighed and rose to his feet. "Duty calls," he said to Elizabeth. "Rest that ankle. Maria will be back soon with lunch." She watched him stride away, noting the easy authority in his bearing and the way the young cowboy clearly respected him. There was something compelling about Ethan Prescott, a quiet strength that drew her in despite her best intentions to maintain appropriate distance. The remainder of the day passed quietly. Elizabeth alternated between sketching, reading a dog-eared copy of Ivanhoe she found in the sitting room, and resting as Maria insisted. By evening, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising the rain Ethan had predicted. Supper was a simple affair, with just the three of them at the table. Ethan, exhausted from a day of wrangling cattle and mending fences, was more subdued than he had been that morning, though he inquired politely about Elizabeth's ankle and whether she had everything she needed. As they finished the meal, the first rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. Ethan excused himself to ensure the animals were properly sheltered, leaving Elizabeth to help Maria clear the table despite the older woman's protests. "He works too hard," Maria observed, glancing at the door through which Ethan had disappeared. "Takes too much on himself since Mr. Jenkins stays in town more." Elizabeth nodded. "He seems like a man accustomed to carrying heavy burdens." "The heaviest are the ones no one can see," Maria replied cryptically. She patted Elizabeth's hand. "You should sleep, Señorita. The storm will be upon us soon." By the time Elizabeth had settled in her room, rain was lashing against the windows, driven by a rising wind. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating her room, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. She had always found storms soothing rather than frightening, and soon the rhythmic patter of rain against the roof lulled her toward sleep. A particularly loud crack of thunder startled her awake some time later. For a moment she was disoriented, uncertain what had woken her. Then she heard a cry of distress, not from outside but somewhere within the house. Elizabeth sat up, listening intently. There it was again, a hoarse shout, followed by what sounded like thrashing. Concerned, she lit the lamp beside her bed and reached for the shawl Maria had lent her. Wrapping it around her shoulders over her nightgown, she made her way cautiously to the door, her injured ankle protesting with each step. The hallway was dark, but another flash of lightning showed her the way toward the source of the sounds, Ethan's room at the end of the corridor. As she approached, the noises became clearer. Harsh, ragged breathing, muttered words she couldn't quite make out, and the restless movement of someone caught in the grip of a nightmare. Elizabeth hesitated outside his door. To enter a man's bedroom uninvited was beyond improper, but the obvious distress in those sounds compelled her forward. She knocked gently. "Ethan," she called softly, "are you all right?" No response came except another anguished cry. Concern overriding propriety, Elizabeth carefully opened the door. Lightning illuminated the room in stark white flashes, revealing Ethan tangled in his bedsheets, his face contorted in what could only be described as terror. "No," he cried out, still trapped in his dream. "Sarah, get out." The fire, understanding, dawned on Elizabeth. Maria had mentioned a sister lost in a fire. This nightmare clearly revisited that trauma. She moved to his bedside, setting her lamp on the nearby table. "Ethan," she called, louder this time. "Ethan, wake up. You're dreaming." When he didn't respond, she carefully touched his shoulder. His skin was hot beneath her fingers, damp with sweat. "Ethan, please wake up. You're safe. It's just a dream." His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a terrifying moment, he didn't seem to recognize her, his hand closing around her wrist with bruising force. Then awareness returned, and he released her immediately, sitting up and putting distance between them. "Elizabeth," he gasped, raking a trembling hand through his hair. "What are you?" "I'm sorry, did I hurt you?" "No," she assured him, rubbing her wrist. "I heard you calling out. You were having a nightmare." Embarrassment and something like shame crossed his features, visible in the lamplight. "You shouldn't be here," he said gruffly, his voice still ragged. Not proper. Elizabeth should have agreed, should have apologized and retreated to her room. Instead, she found herself sitting carefully on the edge of his bed. "Propriety seems less important than making sure you're all right," she said quietly. He looked away, his profile tense in the flickering light. "It happens sometimes. The war, the fire, they come back at night." He glanced at her. "You heard." It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth nodded anyway. "You called out for Sarah." Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might order her to leave. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. "My sister," he confirmed. "She was 16. Our family farm in Virginia caught fire during the war. Federal troops were burning everything in their path." The bitterness in his voice was old but still potent. "I was away fighting. Couldn't save her." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth whispered, understanding now why he had ridden into danger without hesitation to save her from the wildfire. "It wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" His laugh held no humor. "Should have been there, should have protected her." He looked down at his hands. "Yesterday, when I saw you surrounded by those flames, for a moment I thought I was being given another chance." The raw honesty of this confession struck Elizabeth to her core. Without thinking, she reached out to take one of his hands in both of hers. "You did save me," she said gently. "And I believe Sarah would be proud of the man you've become." He stared at their joined hands, then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. In his gaze, Elizabeth saw pain and loss, but also a flicker of something that might have been hope. Outside, the storm raged on, rain pelting against the windows and thunder rumbling overhead. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one Elizabeth wasn't sure she was prepared to weather. Ethan seemed to come to himself suddenly, gently withdrawing his hand from hers. "You should go back to your room," he said, his voice steadier now. "It's late." Elizabeth nodded, knowing he was right. Whatever moment they had shared was passing, and the realities of their situation reasserted themselves. She was a respectable schoolteacher, alone in a man's bedroom in the middle of the night. If anyone knew, her reputation would be in tatters. Yet as she rose to leave, she found herself reluctant to break this newfound intimacy. "Will you be all right?" she asked. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Been managing these demons for years, Miss Robbins. One more night won't break me." She recognized the dismissal for what it was, not unkind but firm. "Good night, then," she said, retrieving her lamp. At the door, she paused and looked back at him, still sitting on the edge of his bed, his powerful frame silhouetted against the storm-dark window. "Thank you for telling me about Sarah. I'm honored by your trust." Before he could respond, she slipped out, closing the door softly behind her. As she made her slow way back to her room, Elizabeth acknowledged to herself that something fundamental had shifted between them. Ethan Prescott was no longer simply the man who had saved her life. He was becoming someone whose pain she felt as keenly as her own, whose rare smiles she treasured, whose trust she valued above propriety. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Morning brought clear skies and the fresh, washed feeling that follows a heavy rain. Elizabeth woke early, her dreams filled with images of Ethan and fire and things she dared not examine too closely in the light of day. Her ankle felt better, though still tender when she put weight on it. She dressed carefully in the borrowed blue dress, wondering what awaited her downstairs. Would Ethan be embarrassed by their nighttime encounter? Would he retreat behind walls of formality, pretending it had never happened? To her surprise, she found him alone in the kitchen, frying bacon and eggs over the stove. He glanced up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Maria's visiting her sister in town," he explained, answering her unasked question. took advantage of the cleared roads after the rain. "Hope you don't mind my cooking." "Not at all," Elizabeth replied, moving to the stove beside him. "Though I'm happy to help." He stepped aside slightly to make room for her, handing her a spatula. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Elizabeth felt a small jolt at the contact. If Ethan noticed, he gave no sign. "About last night," he began, his attention seemingly fixed on the bacon sizzling in the pan. "There's no need to discuss it if you'd rather not," Elizabeth interrupted gently. He glanced at her, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. After a moment, he added, "Not many people know about Sarah. Only Maria and Mr. Jenkins." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the significance of his inclusion of her in this small circle. "Your secret is safe with me," she assured him. They worked together in companionable silence, preparing a simple but hearty breakfast. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table rather than the more formal dining room, Elizabeth was struck by the easy domesticity of the moment, as though they had shared countless mornings this way. "Road to town should be clear enough today," Ethan said as they finished eating. "I can take you back this afternoon, once I've checked the north pasture fences." "Oh." Elizabeth tried to hide her disappointment. Of course she needed to return to Yuma. Her students were waiting. Her life was there. Yet the prospect of leaving the ranch, leaving Ethan, filled her with an unexpected sadness. "Yes, that would be fine. Thank you." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Unless you'd prefer to stay another day, give that ankle more time to heal." Hope fluttered in her chest. "I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition," he said with a shrug that didn't quite achieve the casualness he seemed to aim for. "Truth is, it's been pleasant having company." Elizabeth smiled, warmth spreading through her at this admission. "Then I'd be happy to stay another day if you're certain it's no trouble." Something like relief crossed his face. "Good," he said simply, rising to clear their plates. The day passed in a gentle rhythm unlike anything Elizabeth had experienced before. After helping with the breakfast dishes, she accompanied Ethan on a slow tour of the nearby ranch buildings, leaning on his arm when her ankle troubled her. He showed her the barn with its magnificent horses, the chicken coop where she gathered eggs for tomorrow's breakfast, and the small garden Maria tended with such care. Ethan proved to be a knowledgeable guide, his initial reserve gradually melting as he warmed to his subject. Elizabeth found herself fascinated not just by the ranch operations, but by the glimpses of the man himself that emerged through his explanations and anecdotes. By midday, they had settled on the porch, Elizabeth with her slate and chalk, Ethan with a piece of harness he was mending. The companionable silence between them was broken only occasionally by a question or observation. "Have you always wanted to be a teacher?" Ethan asked as he worked a stubborn piece of leather. Elizabeth considered the question. "Not always," she admitted. "As a girl, I dreamed of being an artist. But my parents, particularly my father, viewed art as a suitable hobby for a young lady, not a profession." She smiled ruefully. "Teaching was considered a respectable compromise." "Do you enjoy it?" he asked, his gaze lifting from his work to study her face. "Very much," she said honestly. "There's something deeply satisfying about opening young minds to new ideas, watching them discover the world through books and learning." She hesitated, then added, "But I still paint whenever I can. It feeds my soul in a different way." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Like me with horses," he said. "Ranching pays the bills, but working with the horses, that's where I find peace." Elizabeth smiled, touched by this confession. "I'd like to see you with them sometime," she said without thinking. A slow smile spread across his face, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his features and made her heart beat faster. "I'd like that," he replied softly. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then a ranch hand called from the barn, breaking the spell. Ethan excused himself to deal with whatever problem had arisen, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts and the half-finished sketch of his profile she'd been working on when he wasn't looking. That evening, after a simple supper they prepared together in Maria's absence, they sat before the fireplace in the sitting room. The night had turned cool, and Ethan had built a small fire to ward off the chill. Elizabeth couldn't help but notice how he positioned himself as far from the flames as the room would allow, though he made no comment about it. "Will you return to Boston someday?" he asked unexpectedly as they sipped coffee from chipped mugs. Elizabeth considered the question. "I don't think so," she said finally. "There's nothing for me there anymore. My parents are gone, and the few relatives I have left are more acquaintances than family." She smiled slightly. "Besides, I find I've developed a fondness for wide open spaces and big skies." Ethan nodded, something like satisfaction in his expression. "Takes a certain kind of person to appreciate the territory. Most Easterners can't wait to get back to civilization." "Is that what you consider this? Uncivilized?" she challenged gently. "Different kind of civilization," he corrected. "Harsher in some ways, but more honest. Out here, a person stands or falls on their own merits. No hiding behind family names or social position." Elizabeth thought of Boston society with its rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules. "There's freedom in that," she agreed. "Though I imagine it can be lonely at times." His eyes met hers across the space between them. "It can be," he acknowledged quietly. The firelight cast golden highlights in his dark hair and softened the lines of his face. Elizabeth found herself studying him openly, noting the strength in his jawline, the tiny scar near his right eyebrow, the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheeks when he looked down. "Elizabeth," he began, her name almost a caress in his deep voice. "Yes," she prompted when he fell silent. He seemed to struggle with himself for a moment. "Nothing," he finally said, rising abruptly. "It's getting late. You should rest that ankle." Disappointment washed over her, though she tried not to show it. "Of course," she murmured, accepting his offered hand to help her stand. "Good night, Ethan." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "Good night, Elizabeth," he replied, his voice rough with something she couldn't quite identify. She made her way slowly upstairs, acutely aware of his gaze following her until she disappeared from view. In her room, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts in turmoil. What was happening between them? This connection that seemed to strengthen with each passing hour defied explanation. They were virtual strangers who had known each other barely 2 days, yet she felt drawn to Ethan Prescott in a way she had never experienced before. It was madness, surely. Tomorrow she would return to Yuma and resume her life as the town's schoolteacher. Ethan would continue running the Lazy J. Their paths might cross occasionally in town, but this strange intimacy would fade, becoming nothing more than a curious memory of the time she was rescued from a wildfire. Yet as she prepared for bed, Elizabeth couldn't quite convince herself of this. Something had fundamentally changed, though she couldn't put a name to it. All she knew was that the prospect of leaving the ranch, leaving Ethan, filled her with a sense of loss so acute it almost took her breath away. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams once again filled with fire and flight and Ethan's strong arms around her. She woke before dawn, the house still quiet around her. Unable to return to sleep, Elizabeth dressed and made her way downstairs, careful to avoid the creaking steps she'd noticed the day before. To her surprise, the kitchen was already occupied. Ethan stood at the stove, his back to her, shoulders tense as though wrestling with some internal struggle. He hadn't heard her approach, and for a moment, Elizabeth simply watched him, this strong, solitary man who had ridden through fire to save her life and in doing so, had somehow captured her heart. The realization didn't shock her as it should have. Perhaps some part of her had known from the moment he wrapped her in his coat and placed her on his horse, his arms a shield against the dangers that threatened to consume her. "Ethan," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by something warmer. "You're up early," he observed. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, moving into the kitchen. "I thought I might help with breakfast before we leave for town." A shadow crossed his face at the mention of her departure, but he nodded. "Coffee's almost ready," he said, gesturing to the pot on the stove. They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing a simple meal of eggs and biscuits. Elizabeth found herself hyper-aware of Ethan's presence. The way he moved with easy grace despite his size, how his hands capable of such strength handled delicate tasks with surprising gentleness. As they sat down to eat, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the scene. Elizabeth found herself memorizing every detail, knowing this might be their last quiet moment together. "I'll miss this," she said impulsively, then felt heat rise to her cheeks at the admission. Ethan's eyes met hers, something intense and unreadable in their blue depths. "Elizabeth," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words, an unusual state for a man typically so direct. "Yes," she prompted gently. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I'm not good with words," he said finally. "Never have been, but these past days—" He shook his head slightly as if frustrated with his own inadequacy. "I don't want you to go." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, profound in its honesty. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest, hope and fear warring within her. "I don't want to go either," she whispered. Ethan's expression changed, surprise giving way to something that might have been joy. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not just today, longer." "Ethan, I have responsibilities in Yuma," she reminded him gently, though her fingers curled around his. "My students, I know," he interrupted. "I'm not asking you to abandon them, but perhaps you could come back, on weekends, or I could ride into town to see you." He looked down at their joined hands. "I just know that I'm not ready to say goodbye." The earnestness in his voice touched something deep within her. This wasn't a practiced declaration from a smooth-talking suitor. This was raw, honest emotion from a man who clearly found such revelations difficult. "I would like that," Elizabeth said softly. "Very much." Relief washed over his features, followed by a smile that transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes and revealing a dimple in his right cheek she hadn't noticed before. Without releasing her hand, he stood and moved around the table, drawing her to her feet before him. "I know this is fast," he said, his voice low and intense. "Too fast, probably, but when you've seen as much death as I have, you learn not to waste time with what matters." His free hand came up to gently cup her cheek. "And you matter, Elizabeth Robbins, more than I can say." Her heart seemed to stop, then race forward at his touch. "Ethan," she breathed, unable to find more eloquent words. He searched her face as though looking for permission or perhaps reassurance. Finding what he sought, he slowly lowered his head until his lips met hers in a gentle kiss that nonetheless sent fire racing through her veins, not the destructive flames of the wildfire, but something warming and life-giving. The kiss remained chaste, a promise rather than a demand, but when he pulled back, Elizabeth felt forever changed by it. She had been kissed before chaste pecks from her former fiancé, but nothing had prepared her for the rush of emotion Ethan's kiss evoked. "I should still take you to town today," he said reluctantly, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "People will be wondering about you, and I need to do this properly." "Properly," she echoed, still dazed from his kiss. A smile tugged at his lips. "Court you proper, like a lady deserves. Not keep you here unchaperoned where folks might talk." His expression grew serious. "Your reputation matters. I won't be the cause of gossip that might hurt you." Elizabeth was touched by his consideration, even as part of her wanted to dismiss such concerns. But he was right. In a small town like Yuma, appearances mattered, and her position as schoolteacher required irreproachable behavior. "Then I suppose we should go," she said with a sigh, reluctantly stepping back from his embrace. "Though I will hold you to your promise of visits." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Count on it," he said simply. They finished breakfast quickly, then prepared for the journey to town. Ethan saddled Storm while Elizabeth gathered her few belongings, including the slate Maria had given her, now filled with sketches of the ranch and surreptitious studies of Ethan himself. The ride to Yuma was bittersweet, Elizabeth seated before Ethan on the saddle as they had been when he first rescued her. This time, though, she leaned back against him without hesitation, savoring the solid strength of his chest against her back and the security of his arms around her. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired between them and what might lie ahead. The landscape showed signs of the wildfire's path, blackened earth, and charred vegetation stark against the otherwise vibrant desert scenery. As they approached the outskirts of Yuma, Elizabeth felt Ethan tense slightly behind her. "What is it?" she asked, twisting to see his face. "Just wondering what kind of welcome awaits," he admitted. "Small towns love gossip, and you've been missing for 2 days." Elizabeth hadn't considered this aspect of their situation. "We'll tell them the truth," she said firmly. "That you saved me from the fire, and I stayed at the Lazy J until the roads were passable again. There's nothing improper in that." He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Maria was there as chaperone," he added. "That should help." Their concerns proved largely unfounded. As they rode down Yuma's main street toward the modest boarding house where Elizabeth rented a room, several townspeople called out greetings, expressing relief at seeing her safe. Ethan was known and respected in town as the Lazy J foreman, which lent legitimacy to their explanation. Mrs. Winters, Elizabeth's landlady, fussed over her injury and expressed profuse gratitude to Ethan for his heroic rescue. If she had any suspicions about the propriety of Elizabeth's stay at the ranch, she kept them to herself. The school board sent word that classes are canceled until next Monday. Mrs. Winters informed Elizabeth as she showed her to her room. "On account of the fire and some families evacuating temporarily, so you have a few days to rest that ankle properly." Elizabeth thanked her, secretly pleased at the unexpected reprieve. It would give her time to sort through the whirlwind of emotions and events of the past few days. Ethan had remained downstairs, uncomfortable in the feminine domain of the boarding house. When Elizabeth returned to the parlor, he stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand. "Mrs. Winters says you're to join us for supper," Elizabeth told him with a smile. "Her way of thanking you for the rescue." He looked startled, then pleased. "That's kind of her, but I should get back to the ranch before dark." Disappointment washed over Elizabeth, though she tried not to show it. "Of course," she murmured. "You have responsibilities." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I'll be back day after tomorrow," he promised. "Need to check on a cattle buyer in town anyway. Thought I might call on you properly if that's acceptable." Joy replaced disappointment, bringing a smile to Elizabeth's face. "That would be very acceptable, Mr. Prescott." A matching smile warmed his features, reaching his eyes in a way that made her heart skip. "Until then, Miss Robbins," he said formally, though the look in his eyes was anything but proper. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth standing in the parlor with her hand pressed to her lips where she could still feel the ghost of his kiss. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. Elizabeth received visitors, concerned colleagues from the school, parents of her students, and even the town doctor who insisted on examining her ankle. All expressed relief at her safe return and praised Ethan's heroic rescue, though Elizabeth noted a few speculative glances and carefully worded questions about her time at the ranch. She answered truthfully but selectively, emphasizing Maria's presence and omitting certain details like her nighttime visit to Ethan's room during the storm or the kiss they had shared in the kitchen. Some things were too precious, too private to share with curious townspeople. By the time Ethan arrived for his promised visit, Elizabeth was nearly sick with anticipation. She had changed her dress 3 times before settling on a modest blue gown that nevertheless complemented her figure and brought out the green in her eyes. Mrs. Winters announced his arrival with a knowing smile that made Elizabeth blush. She descended the stairs carefully, her ankle much improved but still tender, to find Ethan standing in the parlor, hat in hand and a bouquet of wildflowers similar to those she had been painting the day of the fire, clutched somewhat awkwardly in his other hand. He had made an effort with his appearance, she noted with pleasure. His dark hair was neatly combed, his shirt and vest were clearly his Sunday best, and his boots had been polished to a shine. But what truly captured her attention was the way his face lit up when he saw her as though she were the sunrise after a long, dark night. "Miss Robbins," he greeted her formally, aware of Mrs. Winters hovering nearby. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Mr. Prescott," she replied with equal formality, though her smile held nothing proper in it. "I'm feeling much recovered." He thrust the wildflowers toward her. "Thought you might like these," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice, "to replace the ones you were painting when—" "Well, you know." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "They're beautiful," she said softly, accepting them with a smile. "Thank you." Mrs. Winters bustled forward with a vase. "Let me take those for you, dear. Why don't you and Mr. Prescott sit on the porch? It's a lovely afternoon, and I've made lemonade." Elizabeth recognized the offer for what it was, a chance for private conversation within the bounds of propriety, as the porch was visible from the street, but afforded more privacy than the parlor where other boarders might interrupt. Once settled on the porch swing, lemonade in hand and a discreet distance between them, Elizabeth felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "How are things at the ranch?" she asked. "Same as always," Ethan replied with a small smile, "though quieter without you there." He hesitated, then added, "Maria asked when you might visit again. Think she enjoyed having another woman around. Just Maria." Elizabeth teased gently, his eyes met hers, all pretense of casualness vanishing. "No," he said simply, "not just Maria." Heat rose to Elizabeth's cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. To cover her reaction, she took a sip of lemonade before asking, "How long will you be in town?" "Heading back tomorrow," he replied. "Cattle buyer is coming to the ranch next week. Need to get things ready." He paused, then added carefully, "Thought I might escort you to church on Sunday if you're amenable, and perhaps dinner after." The formal invitation, so carefully phrased, made Elizabeth smile. This was what he had meant by courting properly: public outings, respectable activities, building a relationship that would withstand the scrutiny of small-town gossips. "I would like that very much," she said warmly. Relief flickered across his face, as though he had genuinely feared rejection. "Good," he said simply. They talked for nearly 2 hours, moving from safe topics like ranch operations and Elizabeth's teaching to more personal matters, her childhood in Boston, his experiences during the war, their shared love of books despite his limited formal education. By the time Mrs. Winters called them in for supper, Elizabeth felt as though she had known Ethan Prescott for years rather than days. Over the next few weeks, their courtship continued with a mixture of proper public outings and more private moments. Ethan rode into town at least twice a week, sometimes on business but increasingly just to see Elizabeth. They attended church together each Sunday, followed by dinner either at the hotel restaurant or, as they grew more comfortable with each other, picnics by the river away from prying eyes. On those picnics, they could speak more freely, and occasionally Ethan would take her hand or steal a quick kiss when they were certain no one was watching. Elizabeth found herself falling deeper in love with this complex man, strong yet gentle, reserved yet passionate, haunted by his past yet determined to build a future. October brought cooler temperatures, and the cattle sale that had been occupying much of Ethan's time and attention. With that business successfully concluded, he invited Elizabeth to spend a Saturday at the ranch, with Maria as chaperone, of course. The day was perfect, clear skies, gentle breezes, and the desert landscape painted in autumn hues. Ethan showed her the horses he was training, demonstrating his natural way with the animals. Elizabeth sketched as he worked, capturing on paper the fluid movements and evident bond between man and beast. "You're truly gifted," Ethan said later as he examined her sketches. They sat on the porch, Maria busily preparing supper inside. "These capture exactly what it feels like to work with them." Elizabeth flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "I've been practicing," she admitted. "I bought some proper art supplies in town, been sketching the students the desert." Memories of that first day here. His expression sobered at the reference to the wildfire. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Coming west, I mean, after what happened." Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "How could I regret a decision that led me to you?" Ethan's eyes darkened at her words, and he glanced toward the house to confirm Maria wasn't watching, before leaning forward to kiss her a deeper, more urgent kiss than their previous careful embraces. Elizabeth responded in kind, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart racing beneath her palm. When they separated, both slightly breathless, Ethan took her hand in his. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I love you. I think I've loved you since I saw you surrounded by that fire, so afraid yet still fighting. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you'll have me." Joy washed over Elizabeth, bright and overwhelming. "Ethan," she whispered, squeezing his hand, "I love you too, so much." Relief and happiness transformed his features. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, which he held out to her, a delicate gold ring set with a modest diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Only thing I have left of her. I'd be honored if you'd wear it as my wife." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she looked from the ring to the man offering it, this strong, honorable man who had ridden through fire to save her life, and in doing so had captured her heart. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Prescott." His hand trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed somehow symbolic of their relationship, meant to be, despite the unlikeliness of their meeting. Maria found them still sitting close together, hands intertwined, when she came to call them for supper. One look at their faces and the ring glinting on Elizabeth's finger told her everything she needed to know. With a cry of delight, she embraced them both, tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I knew," she declared triumphantly. "From the moment he carried you through that door, I knew you would heal each other's hearts." They were married 4 weeks later in Yuma's small church, with the entire town turning out for the event. Mr. Jenkins gave Elizabeth away. Maria wept happily in the front pew, and even the most dedicated gossips had to admit that the love between the schoolteacher and the ranch foreman was genuine and deep. Elizabeth continued teaching until the end of the school year, riding to and from town with Ethan, or occasionally staying at her old boarding house when weather or his duties made daily travel impractical. But the lazy Jay was home now, and with each passing day, she added feminine touches to the ranch house that had for so long been a place of work rather than a true home. Their first Christmas together brought a heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for nearly a week. They spent the days in peaceful domesticity, Ethan handling essential ranch chores while Elizabeth baked with Maria, prepared simple gifts for the ranch hands, and worked on a special present for her husband. A painting of the moment they first met, with Ethan on horseback emerging from the smoke to rescue her. When she presented it to him on Christmas morning, tears filled his eyes, the first she had seen since their wedding day. "This is how you saw me?" he asked, his finger tracing the image of himself, heroic and strong against the backdrop of fire. "This is how you are," she corrected gently. "My hero. My love." He set the painting carefully aside and pulled her into his arms, his kiss expressing what words could not: gratitude, love, and the still astonishing joy of having found each other against all odds. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the landscape, and the news that Elizabeth was expecting their first child. Ethan's reaction to the announcement was everything she could have hoped for: stunned silence, followed by a whoop of joy that brought Maria running from the kitchen, certain something was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," Ethan assured her, his arm tight around Elizabeth's waist. "Everything's perfect. We're having a baby." Maria's delighted exclamations and immediate prayers for a boy, to help his papa with the ranch, made them both laugh, though privately Elizabeth suspected Ethan would be equally enchanted with a daughter, especially one who might resemble the sister he had lost so long ago. As Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed, Ethan became even more protective, insisting she rest frequently and hiring a young woman from town to help with household duties. Elizabeth bore his fussing with good humor, recognizing it as an expression of love rather than doubt in her capabilities. Their son, Samuel James Prescott, was born on a clear October night almost exactly 1 year after the wildfire that had brought them together. He arrived with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair that promised to be as unruly as his father's. Ethan, who had paced the hallway throughout Elizabeth's labor, wept openly when Maria placed the swaddled infant in his arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, bringing the baby to Elizabeth's side. "Just like his mother." Elizabeth gazed up at her husband, exhausted but radiantly happy. "I was thinking," she said softly, "that perhaps if our next child is a girl, we might name her Sarah." Ethan's eyes filled again, overwhelming emotion evident on his usually composed face. "I'd like that," he managed, his voice rough. "Very much." As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under Ethan's capable management. When Mr. Jenkins decided to retire to California for his health, he offered Ethan the opportunity to buy the Lazy J at a price that, while still challenging, was within reach if they were careful with their savings. "It's what I've dreamed of," Ethan admitted to Elizabeth as they discussed the opportunity late into the night. "Owning the land, building something permanent to pass on to Samuel and any other children we might have. But it's a risk and a burden I won't take on if you're not completely certain." Elizabeth had no doubts. "This is our home," she said simply. "And you were born to run this ranch, Ethan. We'll find a way to make it work." With careful planning, hard work, and a small loan from the bank in Yuma, where Elizabeth's reputation as a former teacher and Ethan's standing as an honest businessman carried significant weight, they became the owners of the Lazy J Ranch in the spring of 1884. That summer brought both challenges and blessings. A drought threatened the cattle until unexpected July rains saved the day. Elizabeth discovered she was expecting their second child just as Samuel took his first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor. And a letter arrived from Boston from Elizabeth's former fiancé, of all people expressing belated regrets for his treatment of her and suggesting, in carefully ambiguous terms, that she might wish to return east now that the adventure had presumably worn thin. Elizabeth read the letter aloud to Ethan, who listened with a raised eyebrow and increasingly amused expression. When she finished, he took the paper from her hands and tossed it into the fireplace, where it curled and blackened in the flames. "Not tempted, then?" he asked with a twinkle in his eye. "By the grand Boston society life he's offering," Elizabeth laughed, resting her hand on her slightly rounded abdomen where their second child grew. "I chose the better man," she said simply, "and the better life." Ethan pulled her close, his hand covering hers over their unborn child. "When I rode into that fire 3 years ago," he said softly, "I thought I was saving you, never realized you'd end up saving me right back." "That's what love is," Elizabeth replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Riding through fire for each other, again and again, for all our days." Outside their window, the Arizona sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, reminiscent of the flames that had first brought them together. But where that fire had threatened destruction, the warmth they had found in each other promised only life and love, and hope for all the years to come. In the years that followed, the Prescott family continued to grow and flourish. Sarah Maria Prescott arrived in the winter of 1885, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair. 2 years later, the family welcomed twin boys, David and Daniel, whose boundless energy kept the entire household on their toes. The Lazy J prospered under Ethan's management, weathering the economic challenges that affected many ranches in the territory. Elizabeth divided her time between raising their children, managing the household, and pursuing her art. Her paintings of frontier life began to gain recognition beyond Yuma, with several pieces being exhibited in Tucson, and even as far as San Francisco. Through all the triumphs and trials that life brought their way, Ethan and Elizabeth remained each other's steadfast support and deepest love. Their children grew up knowing the story of how their parents met of a wildfire, a brave rescue, and two hearts finding each other against all odds. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Elizabeth with a special gift, a proper art studio built onto the ranch house, with large windows to capture the desert light she loved so much. As he showed her the space, designed with careful attention to her needs, Elizabeth was reminded once again how thoroughly this quiet, strong man understood her heart. "Do you ever wonder," she asked that night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "what might have happened if there had been no fire that day? If our paths had never crossed?" Ethan considered the question, his arm secure around her shoulders. "I'd like to think we would have found each other anyway," he said finally. "Some things are just meant to be." Elizabeth smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Like us," she murmured. "Exactly like us," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Fire or no fire, Elizabeth Robbins Prescott, you are my destiny, and I wouldn't have it any other way."